Laura Feinstein is SPUR's Sustainability and Resilience Policy Director, leading work on climate mitigation, adaptation, and environmental justice. She has published on California climate policy, safe and affordable drinking water, sea level rise, and we'll see about groundwater rise in the previous presentation, and drought adaptation. She previously worked as a senior researcher at Pacific Institute and as a research scientist and project manager at the California Council on Science Technology, and was a fellow with the California Senate Committee on Environmental Quality, aka Senate EQ, the infamous Senate EQ. Take it away, Laura.
All right, thank you, Dennis. Thanks for having me today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So I'm going to be talking today about a civic vision for growth, sort of borrowing from Bill McKibben's framing, essentially, how as an environmentalist, do we decide what growth to support and what growth to oppose? And of course, drilling down specifically to what that looks like here in the Bay Area. So first, I'm going to talk about what the cost has been of saying no to new housing in the right places in the Bay Area. Well, first of all, home values in the Bay Area have grown higher and faster than anywhere else in the United States. I think we all know that the housing market in the Bay Area has been hot for a long time, but I have to admit, I was surprised to realize how far housing values in the Bay Area have outstripped even very expensive to live places like New York. And as a result, that means the ability of a median income household to afford the median home is shrinking. So there's been a gap between what a median income household can afford to buy and what those median homes cost for a long time, but that gap is growing. So here in 2000, the gap between the median income household's purchasing power and what the median home cost was about $200,000. And that has risen to closer to $400,000 in 2020. And so what that means when you see this kind of gap is that people can, very few people at this point can actually afford to buy a home on their own incomes. Most people who are buying homes these days in the Bay Area rely, at least in part, on a gift from a family member, usually a family member who themselves had an opportunity to buy a home and build wealth in the generations before them. So it's very difficult at this point to be the first generation in your family to buy a home because it's increasingly difficult to shrink this gap. And that's been changing who lives here in the Bay Area. Black households in particular have been leaving the Bay Area entirely or moving from these more core urban areas out to the exurbs. And that is a big difference because there often is less easy access to good, high-paying jobs in these distant suburbs, as well as less access to transit. And it locks them in often to much longer car commutes, which in themselves are very expensive and time-consuming. And because the Bay Area has built more in terms of sprawl growth than infill housing and dense locations, the vehicle miles traveled, the number of miles people drive every day has been going up. I'm sure there's been a change during the pandemic, but this just shows a trend towards more vehicle miles traveled as well as greenhouse gas emissions in the Bay Area going up as a result. And I would imagine most people here at this point have heard or read some of the stories about how many of the racist practices of the last century still influence where people live today. Things like racially restrictive covenants in many cities prevented white families from selling homes to people of color. There also were redlining practices, which essentially said that banks should not give loans to purchase homes in neighborhoods that were mostly occupied by people of color and low-income people. And that, coupled with the fact that these sort of bayshore areas were seen as less desirable because that's where heavy industry was, a lot of pollution, and those places also are vulnerable to flooding. We've seen this concentration in the Bay Area where people of color and low-income people mostly live in these bayshore communities. But one important question to ask is, why do those patterns persist to today? And that is because restrictive practices around where new housing can be built kind of continue to keep the Bay Area very segregated. So for example, here on the right, I'm showing where areas that are where only single family homes are allowed to be built. So these tend to be areas that are wealthier, they tend to be higher resource. They're also, as you can see, further from the bayshore, less vulnerable to flooding. And those are places where only single family homes can be built, meaning the only way to live in those places essentially is to be able to buy a new single family home. And as we were seeing, that's increasingly difficult for anybody who doesn't make a lot of money and doesn't have inherited wealth from a family member. So that's how the practices of today around where we do and don't build housing continue to keep the Bay Area very segregated. And, on top of that, of course, you're seeing that then as a result, it's the lowest income households and people of color that are going to be most vulnerable to the flooding and sea level rise and groundwater rise risk that Christina was just talking about. And as a result of not building infill housing, we have been building instead a lot of new sprawl development. So here on the right is a map from Greenbelt Alliance. It shows currently developed urban areas in the Bay Area in gray, and then outside of those, open space and agricultural land. The areas marked in green are permanently protected. They're usually parkland. The areas that are tan and orange and red are places that are at risk of sprawl development. In particular, you see, of course, these areas that are close to places with high housing values and close to job centers are the places that are at greatest risk of being converted from open space to development. So, Greenbelt Alliance identified 60,000 acres as being at high risk of development. And to give you some sense of what that means, in the last decade, the Bay Area converted 32,000 acres of open space and agricultural land to new development. So we'd expect that at least 60,000 acres of open space would be developed over the next 20 years if we continue with sort of this business as usual way of growing. So that brings us to how we can instead choose to grow in the right places and not so much in the wrong places. And I'm going to be talking a lot about the findings in 2 reports that SPUR put out in 2021. This was part of a big regional strategy that we did that looked at a vision for the Bay Area in 2070 from many different angles, for transportation, for housing, for water use, and so forth. So we essentially looked at 2 different scenarios for development. We said, okay, assuming that job growth sort of continues as expected, how much new housing does the Bay Area need by 2070? And where would it be built under business as usual practices? And where would it be built if we instead followed some better rules about where to put new housing? So what we found, for example, was that under business as usual scenario, the region would not build enough housing to meet demand by 2070, but that it is possible with some different approaches to where we put housing to meet that housing need. And that scenario, this alternative scenario, better scenario, is what we call the new Civic vision. So we followed a number of growth rules in the new Civic vision. So first of all, we said that housing should be mostly new infill housing. It should be concentrated near transit, and it should gently densify some of these high opportunity, very exclusive areas. So what do I mean by gentle densification? Well, what that would mean, for example, for a single family area that we identified as having, for example, very good schools and other amenities, that would mean allowing things like duplexes and accessory dwelling units into those areas. In other places where perhaps you already see, say, four-story buildings, that might be raising the level of some of the other buildings in the vicinity, or allowing instead to go up to a slightly higher height limit in those areas. Another rule we set was that the region should not grow in areas that are highly vulnerable to climate risks or in open space. So here on the left, we're showing which places in the Bay Area are most vulnerable to fire risks. They're marked from dark orange for very high risk down to yellow. And as you can see, they tend to concentrate kind of in these very hilly areas, as well as sort of the wildland urban interface, the open space just outside of developed areas. And we also marked off areas that are vulnerable to flooding and sea level rise as off limits. And as a result, in our new Civic Vision scenario, we add almost no new housing in open space or hazardous areas, whereas under a business as usual scenario, even though it builds far less housing overall, there's almost 400,000 units that are going places that they shouldn't go. Another strategy, of course, is to build more multifamily housing rather than a lot of greenfield development with single-family homes. So in the new Civic Vision, there's a much higher proportion of homes that are at least 2 units or larger, as compared to in business as usual. There's a heavy weighting towards single-family homes, as well as these small multifamily buildings, the 2 to 6 unit size. So in the end, by following all these rules, what we end up with is that the new Civic Vision both builds 800,000 more housing units. It also makes existing neighborhoods that right now are high resource and tend to be heavily white and wealthy, more inclusive and more diverse. And it also results in less sprawl development and preserving the open space and agricultural land that we have, as well as, of course, keeping, not putting much new housing in places where they'll be heavily exposed to climate risks. So what we're showing here is that in the new Civic Vision, about half of new housing goes in places that are near transit and existing downtowns, and nearly another half goes into existing residential neighborhoods, either single-family neighborhoods or neighborhoods that are often single-family also, but are also considered high opportunity areas. Whereas under business as usual, you see far less of the transit-oriented and infill housing, and a great deal more development of places in natural and agricultural land, as well as hazardous areas. Dennis, I realize I didn't set a timer. Do you want to give me a time check? Am I good? I just have 2 more slides, actually.
Yes, you're good.
I'll just keep going. I also want to mention that we did a deep analysis of whether or not the Bay Area can grow in these very ambitious ways and still meet its water needs. You know, this is a question that comes up often. You know, we already know that California is drought, experiences frequent droughts. Climate change will make them more frequent and more severe. So how can we possibly add 2.2 million new homes without stressing our water supplies? Well, the answer to that is that actually, you know, the Bay Area and California as a whole has been decreasing its total water use for a long time now, for about the past 4 decades. And that's because we've been gradually rolling in more efficient water standards for plumbing fixtures, as well as starting to require new development to put in more climate appropriate landscaping than it has in the past. So even as California's population has grown by 40%, by 30% in the last 40 years, our total water use has gone down by 30% in that same time period. And so essentially we just need to stay on track with those trends, meaning continue to adopt better, more efficient standards for newly manufactured plumbing devices, and those gradually get installed into existing homes, as well as encouraging more homes to switch from kind of the traditional landscaping, water-hungry lawns, to climate-appropriate landscaping. And we also found, of course, that more compact growth also tends to use less water per person. And that's because essentially, when you have a multifamily building, that's a number of people sharing just a single yard. Since most residential water use is outdoors, when you have more people sharing a single yard, water use per person goes down greatly. So when we took a look at these different scenarios, we found that if the region were to grow by 2070 as expected under business as usual, which we're calling sprawl growth, versus the new Civic vision, which is the compact growth here is what we labeled it. And housing didn't get any more efficient than it is expected than it would normally do just with the existing standards in place, then yes, water use would vastly increase. More people, more homes, more water use. But if we just rolled in some slightly more efficient standards for indoor devices and aimed for about 50% of homes to put in climate adaptive plants in their yards, we could keep water use essentially the same as it is today. And you might look at these two bars and say, okay, you know, that's interesting, but why is it that sprawl growth is actually showing slightly lower total water use than the compact growth, the new Civic Vision? Well, that's because the new Civic Vision has 800,000 more housing units in it. So this is vastly more people and more housing for only a little more water because they have much smaller yards generally. So we make a host of recommendations. And if I were to try to run through all our recommendations on how to achieve this vision, it would take me another half hour. So I'm just going to highlight a few that I think are interesting and just recommend that you go visit our website and read our reports to see the full array of recommendations. But the upshot essentially of how do we grow in the right places in the Bay Area? Well, we need to continue to put more permanent restrictions on development in open space and agricultural land to protect those places. We had a huge victory on that, of course, in Coyote Valley just a couple of years ago. We also need to do a better job of saying yes to infill housing. And the big ways to do that are to change zoning rules and land use laws. We need to reduce parking minimums for housing and transit-oriented locations. We dedicate a huge amount of space to parking in the Bay Area. It also, having these parking minimums also adds a lot of cost to new housing when you have to add 2 new parking spaces for every unit you want to build. We also recommend that we focus on using community input processes and the California Environmental Quality Act when developing city general plans and zoning ordinances, with zoning ordinances being where you say what type of buildings can go where. And then when new development fits with those local rules, then just approve it ministerially, meaning a city staff person just goes through and checks see if it checks all the boxes for according with local requirements. And if it does, they approve the development, rather than every new project having to go, for example, to the planning council for approval, or go through an extensive city community input and CEQA process. And I'm going to stop myself there. As I said, please take a look at our reports if you'd like to hear more about our recommendations. And with that, thank you, and I'll take questions.
Great, Laura, thank you. There's a couple questions I did want to put to you. One from Andrea Traver, who is recovering from some surgery, actually, but she's still asking tough questions. And she brings up California Forever out in, I never pronounce this correctly, Suisun?
Yeah, near Suisun Bay, right?
Yeah, so currently on the farmland around there, they're aiming for sustainability, but it's a total I was going to say it's an amber field development. I mean, it's a lot of grass, I guess. But anyway, yeah, just your thoughts on California forever.
So, I should start by saying that SPUR itself hasn't taken official position on California forever. So I'm not speaking for SPUR in my comments. But I can tell you my personal comments. So, I think one of the interesting things is that if you really sort of step back from the promotional materials and the very kind of like unusual story about who is behind that development, really is just classic sprawl development, right? It's new housing going in, open space and agricultural land far from transit, right? It's sort of just on a basic level, that is what sprawl development is. Can they make it sustainable? Well, I'm sure that they can build the new housing to meet high energy efficiency standards. I'm sure they could put in solar, for example. But they're not going to be able to conquer the simple fact that they're nowhere near transit, they're nowhere near job centers, and people are going to have to drive a long way to get from where they live to where they need to go every day. And also those areas, as I sort of just went through showing you, we've really shown that if we're willing to build more infill housing, we're willing to accept some densification of our existing neighborhoods, we can conserve all of that open space for the future, and decrease our vehicle miles traveled and have people living in these infill locations. So it really it doesn't have to happen. We really have other options, other better options available to us, is my view.
Okay. Yeah, I was trying to come up with something pithy about new wine in old bottles or old wine in new bottles, but new development and with an old development mindset. But another question, what are your thoughts about how much more the California legislature can push housing before too many single-family residents begin to impact elections? Now, obviously, a number of things you mentioned in terms of recommendations, like parking minimums, have been were addressed with a lot of stuff going on, just with the last session. But this, I guess, more of a general question about pushback. Again, personal opinion.
Good question, but yeah, and I feel like I don't have any answer to it. How far can legislators push pro-housing laws before they start to see potentially that they're facing political backlash and losing elections over it? And the answer is I don't know. At this point, I don't think we've seen there's been a big backlash in some ways. Like there have been a lot of organized efforts to push back against these rules. But overall, the legislators that have really been leading the effort haven't lost seats because of their efforts. So at this point, I think it's worth still going for it. It's the right thing to do and it's necessary. And I think there's a lot of people who also do support this. They just may not live in single family homes, right? There's a lot of people who vote who live in apartments and they live in condos and so forth. I think there's also a lot of people like Scott, who's going to speak after me, who work in things like construction trades, who see the value of building new homes. So I say, let's keep going and see if we can hold together the coalition of support and see how much we can do.
Yeah, we will have Josh Becker on later too, kind of addressing some of these questions.
Sure, he has to walk an interesting political line.
Yeah, he does. But that's what he's there for. So, and you mentioned Scott, and I know Scott is he is ready to go. So we'll just have this question, a very specific question from Polly Rich. The 404 unit development in Bishop Ranch and San Ramon Is that, I guess, a development, a SPUR approved development?
So SPUR actually did used to do this where we would weigh in on individual developments, but we eventually stopped doing that. And also, we really never weighed in one way or the other on developments outside of our 3 core cities of Oakland, San Jose, and San Francisco. So we don't have a view on these particular developments, but what I would do is I would take a look at Greenbelt Alliance, who does weigh in on specific developments and does it throughout the Bay Area to see whether or not these are ones that they've sort of green lighted as being good developments or have said, no, these are the wrong places to grow. And Greenbelt, you know, we're very sort of philosophically aligned with Greenbelt, so we generally agree with them.
Yeah, I've personally got into to kind of create from whole cloth new taking a look at individual developments and doing it was kind of a project to do, and I realized how hard that is to do, and you know, just scale and scope of that. So I really do appreciate what Greenbelt Alliance is doing. Holly also mentions a new housing unit in Danville on Harts Avenue, which I don't really know anything about. I've heard a little bit about the Bishop Ranch thing, which at least, well, it doesn't have a lot of, in terms of transit. I mean, it's been a workplace development, but it's been a car dominated workplace development. So, you know, that would have that as well. So anyway, I really appreciate your coming on and going through this, and perhaps if you wouldn't mind, maybe in the chat, steering people to just some of the reports that are, you know, really worth a look. I mean, we didn't really get into the missing middle report or anything. You know, there's a lot. As you mentioned, anything else we talk about is a half hour each. So, oh well, thanks for the Civic Vision thing there as well. So, okay, well, we'll go over to Scott, and he's going to talk about AB 2011 and a number of things as far as a interesting time as far as a labor movement, especially with the carpenters. Oh, look at this. Yes. All right. You're multitasking like crazy. So
misspelling as well.
Yeah.
Right.
So thanks very much, Laura.
Bye.